Hi, this is Moog Grandmother. It's a semi-modular analog synth. Now, there are quite a few out there, but this one has both character and secrets. By secrets, I mean things that may not be obvious from the panel, like 3 oscillators instead of 2, 2 and even 3 envelopes instead of 1, and the ability to play paraphonically. In this video, I'll go over those things and more, talk about what gives it its character, talk about some pros and cons, what it does and what it doesn't, and go over quite a few patch bay ideas. So with that said, let's get started. Okay, so let's start with what's special about Grandmother, and you'd be surprised, in my opinion, it's not the oscillators and filter. Not that they're not great, on the contrary, they're everything you'd expect from Moog based on their classic modules, but in my opinion, they're not what gives Grandmother her unique character, otherwise she'd sound like other Moogs, and she doesn't. So the first thing that makes this synth special in my opinion is the reverb. There's a real spring in here about this big, and it's completely different than any digital reverb you've ever heard. Not that digital reverbs are bad, but like I said, this one is different and with character. And while you can bypass it completely and play your sounds dry, when you let your sounds and their harmonics hit up against it, it'll sound quite unlike any other reverb you've heard. And if I move the Spring Reverb all the way wet, you can literally hear it singing in the background. The second thing that makes Grandmother special is her mixer. Take a look at what happens to these nice sawtooth waves once they get their heads slashed off by Grandmother. Even a gentle triangle wave gets harmonics added to it. Not to mention 2 of them. Especially as you add more oscillators, there's some serious gain and distortion here. And these harmonics and distortion play nicely into the reverb. Nice. The third thing that's special about Grandmother is its patch bay and modular design. So semi-modular means that a synth works out of the box without any patching, but you can rewire elements of the synth or interface it with modular gear with patch cables. Now, there are plenty of semi-modular synths, but the fact that the jacks are placed next to the module that they interface with here, from a usability perspective, makes patching more inviting than a faraway patch bay. Now, there's also a disadvantage to this kind of layout because you need to think of which cable you want to grab based on the distance between the jacks, otherwise your cable might not reach its target or be too long and get in the way. So patch bay designs like in the Mother 32 do have an advantage for being both one cable size fits all and the fact that the cables are out of the way, but this layout, in my opinion, is much more inviting and user-friendly. There are 41 patch points in Grandmother, most of them are here on top, and there are a few on the back. The fourth and final thing that makes Grandmother special, in my opinion, is the choice of putting interesting sound design features front and center. In particular, I'm talking about the big hard sync button right here that's just begging you to press it, and the interplay between the mod wheel and the LFO as represented by these 3 parameter knobs. Now, these features exist on other synths, but they're typically in a patch bay or hidden menu feature somewhere. So let's start with hard sync. The idea is that rather than have every oscillator roam at its own frequency like this, hard sync forces oscillator 2 to be in line with the frequency of oscillator 1. And that produces some very interesting sonic results like you heard. Now when this battle hits the Spring Reverb, that's what I'm talking about when I say character. On the modulation side, the mod wheel and the LFO are connected through these knobs which are pre-routed throughout the synth. So for example, if I wanted to modulate the pitch of the oscillators, I can control the mod depth with the mod wheel as well as the knob, and the mod rate is set by the LFO. So that's slow and gentle pitch modulation, and deep and fast pitch modulation is basically FM synthesis. And that's the nice thing about having this connected to the mod wheel. You've got FM timbre style changes right at your fingertips. So just like the pitch is connected to the LFO and mod wheel, same goes for the filter cutoff modulation. You set the rate with the rate knob, and you've got depth control with the knob and mod wheel. And this is my point about accessibility of a feature means that it's going to get used. So cutoff modulation can be slow and gentle, or fast and furious. And that's where again the reverb can do its thing. Check that out. I tell you, there's just something about this reverb. Okay, let's move on. Now, before I mentioned that Grandmother has 3 oscillators, but if you look at the oscillator section, you'll only see 2. And that's because the LFO can function as a fully tuned oscillator. This is very similar, by the way, to the original Mini Moog manufactured in the 70s, but there you have 3 oscillators where the third can be an LFO. Here you've got an LFO that can also behave as an oscillator. So in order to make this work, I need to connect the LFO to the keyboard. The way you do that is patch in a cable from here to here. And then in order to hear it, I'll take the output of the LFO waveform and replace the noise generator with it in the mixer. So now I've got oscillator 1, oscillator 2, and the LFO, which I need to tune. Oh, and quick synth tip, I'll change it to a sawtooth. It's always easier to tune oscillators by ear if they have more harmonics. And now I've got a 3 oscillator synth. By the way, you can also fine-tune this using the Shift key. Now obviously you don't need to tune the oscillators to the same note. You can create chords. You can tune this any way you want, and it's quite simple to make 3-note chords. So, like I said, 3 oscillators, and since each of these oscillators has its own pitch input using some external help, which I'll show you later, you can play these 3 oscillators paraphonically too. So let's just go briefly through the waveforms. With the LFO, you can transpose like this using this shift combination. Oops. Okay, just like that. And these are the waveforms: sine, saw, ramp, pulse. Unlike the other 2 oscillators, you can't have pulse width modulation here. And of course, you can drive these as well. And then with the other 2 oscillators, you get these wave shapes: triangle, sawtooth, Both oscillators can be transposed individually using these switches, or together using these. Next up is square, with pulse width modulation, of course, either very fast or slow and deep. And a variation to the square wave is pulse, which can be modulated through 0 to rhythmic effect. Okay, so going down the signal chain, we talked about modulation, oscillators, and the mixer. I'm going to skip the utilities section because it doesn't go through the signal chain by default, and we'll talk about the filter. So this is a classic Moog 4-pole or 24 dB per octave low-pass filter, which means it lets you hear the frequencies below the cutoff frequency and quickly decreases the volume of those above it. You can have the cutoff frequency track the keyboard as you play it in two different ways, or just have it stay in the same place, regardless of the note you play. And as per classic Moog ladder filter design, you can also add resonance, which is an emphasis or amplification of the signal directly at the cutoff point. And that does come at a price of lowering the level of everything else, especially the bass. And the resonance will self-oscillate. And you can play it as a fourth oscillator if you like, because it tracks the keyboard on a volt per octave basis perfectly as well. Finally, for the filter, you have bipolar envelope amount control, which will move the filter cutoff either in a positive or negative direction based on the direction this knob is pointing. So you can see here on the attack phase, the filter cutoff is moving up as I press the note, and if I move it into the negative territory, the filter will move down on attack and then back up on the decay. And it will follow, of course, sustain and release as well. So this brings us naturally into the envelope section. So the envelope section has classic ADSR capabilities. Attack is how the volume ramps up when you hit a key. Decay is the decline to the sustain level, how long that takes. And then release is how volume decays after you leave a note. Now, if you're familiar with other synths and used to seeing 4 knobs or 4 sliders, here there's 1 slider and 3 knobs, and I actually think this makes a lot more sense than 4 identical knobs or sliders. Not because I care much about whether it's a knob or a slider, but because attack, decay, and release control the time it takes something to happen, while sustain is a level. Now, just like there aren't 2 oscillators, but really 3, there's actually not 1, but 2 envelopes here. If you move this little switch here, it will disconnect the main envelope from the VCA and behave as a simpler sustain-release envelope. So the advantage of this second envelope is that it frees up this envelope to mess with other things and not interfere with the level of the note you play. While we're on the VCA module, the third setting is drone, which just lets you mess around with parameters without having to hold the key. Now, since we already talked about the reverb, let's swing all the way here and talk about the arpeggiator and sequencer. This section basically has 2 modes. You're either in arpeggiator mode or sequencer mode. In arpeggiator mode, you can play notes back, either based on the order you played them, forward and backward, randomly, and across 1, 2, or 3 octaves. Let's hear what the reverb has to say about this. And then in sequencer mode, the controls have different meaning. You've got 3 sequences. that can go up to 256 steps each. To record a sequence, you just go into record mode and then play it back. Here too, you can go forward and backward and play randomly. As you sequence, you can add a rest if you like, tie notes together, or create a legato between them, and also add an accent. Glide has two modes. It will either create portamento or a slide between two notes that are connected via legato, or any two notes. Holding the shift and turning the glide knob to the right activates this legato glide only mode. Shift and turning the glide knob to the left activates constant glide regardless of legato. By the way, once you've created an initial step sequence, you can record over it live. Alright, so that was an overview of Grandmother without a lot of patching. Now let's dive into a few more sounds and capabilities you can only unlock with the patch bay and these nice little cables. So the keyboard on Grandmother detects velocity, how hard you press the keys, and it sends that information out as voltage through this output. So I can patch that into any number of places, but a nice place to start is the filter cutoff. And you can hear as I press the key softly, it sounds like this, but the harder or faster I press it, I could also patch into the pitch of oscillator 2 and turn on sync, and have keyboard velocity change the tone quite dramatically. Sequencer accents also go out this jack as brief envelopes. That's the third envelope I mentioned earlier. Another patch bay only feature is the sample and hold out of the LFO. Sample and hold is basically just random voltage that goes out in time with the LFO. Let's try that, for example, with hard sync as well. And without hard sync, we can summon R2D2. Now, by default, voltages coming out of the LFO, whether it's sample and hold or the regular LFO out, oscillate between extreme high and low voltages, which results in these extreme pitch changes. If I wanted to tone down these changes a little bit, I can use the attenuator. So I'll go in through here, and then go back out into the pitch of oscillator 2. And now the attenuator has the effect of restraining or increasing the voltage swings of the LFO. So that's one function that the attenuator has, but it has two more. The second function it has is as an inverter, so this is actually an attenuverter because it can inverse the polarity of an incoming signal. So you could use that, for example, to change a sawtooth wave into a ramp waveform. And the third thing that this can do, if you don't plug anything into the input, it will output voltage up to 8 volts out of this output. So this can be practical in any number of situations, but for example, oscillator 2 will only move with this knob 7 semitones up and 7 semitones down. If we wanted a greater range of flexibility, we could take the output of the attenuator, plug it into the pitch of oscillator 2, and now we'd get a much bigger range. So you can use this to send manual voltage changes to any input on Grandmother or outside of it. And while we're here, the oscillators have two additional inputs that give them more flexibility. There's pulse width modulation in for oscillator 1, if you wanted to modulate that independently of the LFO, for example with an envelope. And there's a linear FM input for oscillator 2, which is a way to rapidly modulate the frequency of oscillator 2 with less inharmonic sidebands compared to exponential FM. Another feature that you can access only using the patch bay is the high pass filter. This is a non-resonant 6 dB per octave high pass filter, which you can either chain with the low pass filter in a serial way or in parallel. Chain them one after the other, and you effectively get a bandpass filter. Another little hidden gem in the patch bay is the ability to sync the LFO to the rate of the sequencer. So I'll start this sequence, and I can have the LFO just free running, but I can sync it directly to the gate for very pleasing rhythmic results. Alright, let's move on to some more patch bay shenanigans. One of the oldest synth tricks in the books is to plug the filter back into the mixer, and this can produce anything from nice to crazy feedback results. For gentle tremolo, pass the LFO through the attenuator and then back out to the VCA. And that's how you get tremolo. The last utility that I didn't talk about is the mult, which has two uses. One is to take one control voltage input and split it out to 3 different places. So for example, I could share the sample and hold love with, say, the filter cutoff and oscillator pitch. Why not? And that's essentially how to control 3 destinations with 1 source. And it can also serve as a basic audio mixer. You can take 2 inputs in and output 1 wherever you want. Now obviously there are a gazillion other things you can do with a patch bay. Let me show you just one more. I'll take the output from the LFO, plug it into the attenuator, and then take the output of the attenuator and modulate the pitch of, say, oscillator 1. And what I'm going for here is to take a square LFO and use it to create a modulated bass line at melodically pleasing intervals. Paired with a tempo-synced sequencer, this can produce interesting results. Okay, for my final trick, I promised you we can play paraphonically. Now, you can get voltage as pitch into any of the 3 oscillators. I include the LFO in this, and I'm not counting the filter cutoff point, which you can play as well. Now, in this demonstration, I'm using control voltage from the key step, but you can use any modular sequencer, any keyboard that can output control voltage. And as long as you get the oscillators in tune and in the right octave, and there you go. We can play 2 different notes at a time. They share the envelope and filter. And for extra credit, by the way, you can separate the 2 using the 2 envelopes on board. Now in this particular case, because the Grandmother keyboard moves both oscillators at the same time, what I'm playing on the key step is really a transposed version of what's going on the Grandmother keyboard. But if you've got multiple control voltage sequencers or keyboards, you can play each of the oscillators completely separately. And for a little more modular madness, I'm going to program a sequence on the key step, and that's going to run in the background. So when I hit a key, I'm going to have 1 static oscillator and another one cycling. And if I turn on the arpeggiator, I can use the octave feature to transpose the key step sequence. Messing around with the tempo is also fun, and you can have them synced if you want. And let's say if I hold 2 notes on the arpeggiator, you can see why 2 sequencers or arpeggiators are better than 1. Okay, cool. So let's summarize. So let's look at some pros and cons. The first thing you should know about this synth is that you can't save presets. Now, I know that almost goes without saying for most analog synths, but for newbies considering this as their first synth, it's something you should be aware of. You can, however, like I mentioned before, save up to 3 sequences. Finally, and this is a small thing, if you want to configure anything here, like say a MIDI channel, there's a series of key presses you need to do that. It would be nice if there was some software, so if you're next to a computer, you could make this configuration without a series of key steps where you need to consult a manual. And on the pro side, well, it's basically everything else I said. You know, I said it in the beginning and I'll say it again. Grandmother is a synth with character. Its colorful design is a good indication of what's going on the inside. There are plenty of colors and moods to play with, from angry to soft, from raspy to gentle. Grandmother is an extremely special synth. Now, I'll be exploring how Grandmother pairs with other gear soon, so hit subscribe and click the little YouTube bell if you want to be notified when that comes out. Ask me anything in the comment section below. Hit like if you found this video useful. Thanks very much for watching.